The Epic of Gilgamesh is a lengthy poem written on tablets that dates back to the time of ancient Mesopotamia. It is regarded as one of the earliest great works of literature, and it is one of the oldest written poems in the world. It was discovered in an ancient library in a place called Nineveh, which today is the north of Iraq, in the year of 1853 by Austin Henry Layard and his assistant Hormozd Rassam. Today, the tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh can be found in Soleimania Museum in Iraq. Archaeologists have dated the Epic of Gilgamesh to be about 2100 BCE, which is about the same time the Jewish Bible, the Torah, says the flood was occurring, which is 2105 BCE. The Epic of Gilgamesh has many similarities to both the biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the worldwide flood of Noah. The chart describes the comparisons between the Epic of Gilgamesh and what the Torah has to say. Let's first compare the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh to Adam and Eve. Biblical accounts of Adam. In both documents, a man is created from the dirt of the ground by God, Genesis 2:7, and lives in a natural setting amongst the animals, Genesis 2:19. In both accounts, the place where they live is called Eden, Genesis 2:8, and he is introduced to a woman, Genesis 2:22, who tempted him to eat special plants, Genesis 3:2. In both stories, the man accepts food from the woman, Genesis 3:6, covers his nakedness, Genesis 3:7, and must leave his former realm, Eden, Genesis 3:23. We see that in both accounts, there was a deceiving snake, Genesis 3:1. In both accounts, civilization became very corrupt and sinful, Genesis 6:5-7. This prompted God to bring a massive flood to the entire world, Genesis 7:11. Additionally, in both accounts, God then chose the only righteous man, Genesis 6:9, in the world to build an ark for him and his family to ensure the survival of the human race. In addition, in both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Torah, God commands the righteous person to gather a sample of each and every animal species to ensure their survival. Also, in both accounts, birds, doves, and ravens were used after the storm of the flood ceased to determine whether the flood's water had subsided to see if there was dry land, Genesis 8:6-12. In both situations, after the water subsided, a huge boat came to rest on the mountain, Genesis 8:4, and sacrifices were offered afterwards to God, Genesis 8:20, in which God was pleased, Genesis 8:21, and God gave blessings, Genesis 9:1-3. Also it says in both accounts that God says he will never destroy the world again, Genesis 8:21-22. Professor Andrew R. George from the University of London says that the Genesis flood narrative parallels to the Epic of Gilgamesh so closely that it leaves no doubt that they descend from the same source. The most likely assumption we can make is that both Genesis and Gilgamesh drew their materials from a common tradition about the flood that existed. These stories then diverge in the retelling. We see through all these examples that the Epic of Gilgamesh contains very strong evidence that the story of Adam and Eve and Noah's flood are true, as the stories are almost identical. How do we know that the Torah didn't copy these stories from the Epic of Gilgamesh? Even though the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the Jewish Bible, this does not contradict the fact that the Torah is divine. As the Torah clearly says, these events took place before the Torah, Jewish Bible, was written. It is not like the Torah claimed that the events of Adam and Eve and the flood of Noah were exclusively Jewish historical. Torah claimed that the events of Adam and Eve and the flood of Noah were exclusively Jewish historical events. These events involve all of mankind. Thus, it is logical that many cultures would have documented in the history. It is highly likely that Adam, Eve, and Noah passed these stories down to orally their descendants. Eventually, as time went by, one of them wrote it down as these tablets, and later Moses wrote it down by the word of the God in the Torah. Moreover, the story of the flood in particular is discussed in many different ancient cultures, such as the Chinese, Hindu, Greek, Sumerian, and the list goes on. It is quite interesting that the Chinese called the person who started humanity after the flood by the name of Nova, which is Noah. This sounds very similar to Noah. The strange thing is that nearly all these ancient cultures have a very similar story, despite the thousands of miles of mountains, deserts, and even oceans that separate these civilizations. Additionally, many of these stories were told before there was even the exchange between these civilizations. Therefore, it seems that the Epic of Gilgamesh and all of the other ancient flood stories confirm the biblical account of Adam and Eve and the great flood of Noah.